This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. This is your friendly reminder to rate and review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. This greatly helps others discover the podcast. And please tell a friend. Let somebody know why you listen to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Today's episode is a Deconversion Anonymous episode. In these episodes, people just like you tell their stories of deconstruction and deconversion. I want to remind you, if you're interested in being on the podcast to tell your story, please contact me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Give me the 5-minute version of your story, and maybe you could be on the podcast. My guest today is Fred. Fred grew up as a Catholic, moved on to a charismatic version of Catholicism, and then ran the gamut of various different faith traditions. After listening to several podcasts that were anti-apologetics against cults, he started to recognize the similarity to his own faith traditions. This led to doubts, deconstruction, and deconversion. Fred is not entirely out. He has told a family member, but he is not out to the rest of his family or to the world necessarily. So this is an opportunity for Fred to tell his story in his own words. And now I give you Fred. Fred, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you very much. This is my first time out on one of these, so it's kind of exciting. I had a little prepared statement for anyone who may know me because we're billing this as anonymous. Thanks for listening. If you want to pause right now and talk to me directly, that would be great.
Yes.
I sort of intended this not to be my triumphant exit from Christianity, but more kind of like where I am at this point in my life and how I got here, just from my personal perspective. So if I mention anyone that I know personally, I'll try to keep it nice and just kind of mention that they were present, not assigning blame, etc. So that's kind of where we're going with this.
Yeah, fantastic. And as you mentioned, Fred, this is a Deconversion Anonymous show, and I just want to remind people that, if they are interested in telling their stories, but they're uncomfortable with being completely out, that's fine. I think that telling our stories is super important. It's cathartic for you as an individual, and it's very helpful for the people who are listening to hear your story as well, because there might be touch points that really ring true to them.
Sure.
So with that, let's start. So I understand that you grew up in Catholicism. What was that like?
Yes. I would like to start out with a quote from a famous person, because that's kind of a good way to start a talk, right?
Sure.
So if you've heard of Julia Sweeney and her one-woman show, Letting Go of God.
Yes. Cannot recommend that enough. Please go look that up. Yes.
So I went and found a transcript today. I'm not going to read much of it, but I wanted to remind myself of what she said. She talked about, she's about 8 years older than me. I was born in the year of Star Trek, 1966.
Yeah.
So around the time that Julia Sweeney was in high school, and I was maybe, in grade school age, she said that the attitude of her church towards God, being simply love, had completely changed. And she talked about the changes in the formerly Catholic boys' school where she was now attending because it had turned co-ed.
Okay.
And how the priests had changed their vestments to be a little more folksy, and they were offering chalices made out of pottery. So this was a time in the Catholic Church, as a result of something called the Vatican II Council. As a result of that, people may be familiar, masses were said in local languages as well as Latin. And there were a lot of these folksy kind of changes where the Catholic Church was kind of making themselves familiar to people, right?
Yeah.
And I say all that just because that's the kind of the environment that I was born into. My mom is French Canadian. My dad is from the Northeast US. So they met while they were on vacation from their different locations, and yada, 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 I was born.
Yes.
So
nature took its course.
Yes. So, and I very much appreciate the choices that my parents made at that time, kind of started our family. So they settled in Canada for the first 13 years of my life. And as I said, we were Catholic at that time. Both my parents were raised in parochial schools, with clergy as educators, stuff like that. So, but in their 20s, they had kind of drifted away a little bit until right around the time, I don't know if I'm the cause of this or just sort of a side effect, but right around the time I was to be studying for my first communion, we got back into church regularly, and my parents attended some events that were sponsored by the church at that time, something called Curcio, which is an individual retreat, that groups take, but it's kind of an individual thing.
Okay.
And they also went on Marriage Encounter, which is similar to Protestant type marriage conferences, right?
Yeah.
Now, both of these, I think, sort of revived their faith quite a bit. They got involved with the Catholic charismatic movement, which was happening at the very least in the 70s. I don't know if it happened prior to that, but I kind of remember it being a thing in Catholic churches. And I don't know what's happened since, obviously, because I'll tell you very shortly what happened to us. So my parents were really into this. They were going to Bible studies with the church, Bible studies outside the church. And they became involved with this group of like ex-Catholics or more experimental Catholics who were doing kind of their own thing in home Bible studies. And they were going to this retreat center down south in Albany, New York, that when the parish priest found out about this, he was not real cool with it.
Yeah. Okay.
So my parents at that point decided, you know what, we don't need this Catholic church anymore. This religion stuff kind of didn't appeal to them anymore. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So this has been my parents' thing sort of their whole life. They're not religious, that old B.J. Thomas song. They just love the Lord. Right.
Right.
So that was it. We were out in 1970 something. Right. And shortly thereafter, in 1979, my whole family, we moved to, again, Northeast US, really close to where my dad grew up, because my dad was a salesman and he had the opportunity to transfer. So we did.
Okay.
So I was 13 then.
Yeah.
That was kind of a big change, right?
Yeah.
Here I was, and that's kind of like the time that I credit for being when I gave my life to Christ, right? Because here I was, no friends, and kind of like, I thought at that time, like, obviously my parents had been for the past probably 5 years or more, they would sit around the table and discuss all these books and passages that they were reading, right? My parents were big on talking to each other around the kitchen table.
Sure. Yeah.
So I would hear this stuff, and I guess finally it rubbed off on me, where I said, okay, I'm saying that prayer. Not that we were really in a tradition at that point that really encouraged it. When we moved to the U.S., my parents found another group of probably mostly former Catholics who had a house church. Eventually, they got to where they were. Do you ever have a group in one of your churches where they would rent out to a second group after the service?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So that was
the space. Yeah.
That was us. We went to a Presbyterian church after they were done.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So that was church pretty much for my high school years.
Okay.
So again, I don't know, in giving this some thought, I don't know whether my parents would ever consider themselves Protestant, because they've always been in this sort of charismatic space.
Right. I did want to just interject and just say my dad's side of the family were all Catholic, and my dad, my growing up is a soap opera, but my dad,
yeah, I remember some of it. Yep.
Yeah, my dad very likely committed suicide when he was very young, a few years after I was born. He was also very likely a part of a cult of which I have no details, because nobody was kind of religiously trained enough to figure that out. But the reason I tell the story is when I became a Pentecostal charismatic pastor and went to my dear grandmother, who, his mother, she was deeply concerned for my soul, so she loved me dearly. I kind of, they loved me very much. And I could see the literal fear in her eyes, when I was trying to explain to her my new faith at the time. And so I've always had this interesting relationship with the Catholicism half of my family. And to be totally honest, not a lot of exposure to it necessarily. But anyway, just throw that in there to say.
Yeah, no, well, I can relate to that because I think
Yeah,
now, I mean, I don't get to see either side of my, extended family very much really because I kind of live somewhere in the middle. But
right.
now, unfortunately, the kind of events that I would go to would be like a funeral probably. And then, you're very much aware that, hey, I haven't done this in a long time,
Yeah, yeah.
or maybe you get invited to somebody's first communion or something, and you're certainly not going to partake of communion because it's not right anymore. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah. No, I don't do that when I'm in a Protestant church, and I don't do that if I'm in a Catholic church. But yes.
yeah, I mean, that's one thing I passed by in my early years was I was born with some congenital problems, right? So they were a little concerned for my soul. So I was actually baptized twice.
Yeah. Okay. Just to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but now I would not probably participate much at all. Like even kneeling and standing at the right times. I don't even know if I would try to do that. So,
Right. Right. Well, Fred, I interrupted you. So
no, that's fine.
you're going through high school, and kind of part of this Catholic charismatic movement, and what happens next?
Yes, yeah. Well, like I said, we're out at this point. No connection to the Catholic Church, but very much in the charismatic. My parents are very into all the televangelists at that time. Would have been like Kenneth Hagin, Kenneth Copeland,
Okay.
some of the Jewish influenced ones like Sid Roth, and a lot of the Messianic Jewish stuff.
Right. Okay.
My parents caught on to that. I kind of had a surprise recently. I don't know, have you seen anything or talked about this Netflix documentary, The Family?
I've heard so much about it, and I've been reading people's responses. I have yet to watch it, so or read the
Okay.
books, but I'm very interested in both reading the books and seeing the documentary. But please talk about it.
Yeah, so well, I won't get into all that, but it was interesting that I'm listening to the audiobook that the series is based on, and he just drops this name as the official biographer of the founder of this organization, right?
Okay.
The author's name is Norman Grubb. And I said, well, not a household name, right? Well,
Yeah.
it was to me because my parents read several of his books,
Okay.
along their way. He's got a certain theology that, I guess I don't know if it's more mystical or sort of like, again, outside the Protestant Catholic, religious institutions, right?
Sure.
So they were really into that. So when I heard that name, I was like, whoa, this is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
my childhood coming back, but that's just an aside. But that was something my parents were into at that time. So in high school, again, we're in the smaller church. I started kind of transitioning into relationships because in the area where I was, there was a lot of Methodist churches, a lot of smaller United Methodist churches. So
Okay.
I attended a United Methodist youth group because our house church was not big enough to have anything like that. But it was still a small group. Never did any of the stuff that came later as far as purity culture or any of the standard youth group things. I think maybe we went on a few retreats.
Yeah.
Then, that's about it. I made some friends. It was overall positive. And then as I got closer to college years, we scouted out several colleges in the area, and being like maybe, anywhere from 2 to 5 hours away. And I picked one. I can discuss my alma mater and maybe again related to the family because this was a Christian liberal arts school
Hmm.
that was distinguished itself for educating not just people who are going to be pastors and missionaries, right? This
Right.
was across the board science and math, business, education, but it was all in a Christian context. So I definitely going into the college, like the biology was taught by people who were also researchers in creation science, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So they walked that line. It was not totally anti-learning, but it was also very, very influenced by that.
Right.
When I got into college after the first week, I met the woman who would become my wife. Up until that point, spiritually speaking, like I was basically the squeakiest clean kid you'll ever meet. And some of that was because, like you, I'd seen certain things in my family life where, well, I don't want to do that stuff. People do that stuff, get messed up.
Right. Right.
You know, even smoking, like as I was a young teenager, my parents were trying to quit.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, they're having a really hard time. Maybe this is a bad idea. So I was influenced by all that stuff, and I never did any of it, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I completely relate. Like my entire family, virtually everyone smokes like a train. And, many of them have COPD and, they've died of that.
Yeah.
Had the same experience of just, I just think maybe I won't do this.
Right. So it's not, again, I would say it's not God's protection at that point. It was just my personality that just did not agree with any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, my whole family basically in one way or another kind of steered me toward not doing a lot of the things that I had seen, right?
Right.
So I got to college, and my one hurdle in my Christian life was, hormones.
Yes.
Growing up, I found my way to certain materials which were a little harder to come by back then, before the internet.
Yes.
So I kind of, doing what young men do. And again, fortunately, I guess the girls that I had dated in high school were pretty, decent girls, and we had not gotten into any kind of trouble.
Yeah.
Then I met this girl, who would later become my wife. So I guess we're legit.
Yeah.
We kind of stepped it up a little bit.
Yeah.
That was just another like chink in my armor, right? Where I always felt kind of like I was not living up to the Christian standard because of certain things, like not just like maybe I wasn't enthusiastically witnessing, or because I had read a lot of the Bible on my own. Getting into college, Christian college, they told us, well, of course, you're going to end up with the equivalent of like an associate's degree in Bible, because we did study all that stuff.
Right.
But I always felt this sense of like underperforming, right?
Yeah.
This relationship that we had during college, it was kind of like a lot of will we or won't we, and second guessing ourselves. And and I've heard other couples who were together in college talk about this.
Yeah.
So coming out of college, we did get married pretty much right away, a couple months after. So then that was settled, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Problem solved. You don't want to burn, right? Yeah.
Right. Except it really wasn't, because I'm
Yeah.
still a human male. So,
Yeah.
whatever. Ongoing, it was just another thing that kind of burdened me over the years.
I think something that has been fascinating for me post deconversion is watching people a little younger than us who went through purity culture as it was kind of defined, and even stronger than what we went through.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, that has a huge impact on you, even when it wasn't maybe quite as intense. Men and women, the idea that just having natural human desire, whether that's masturbation, whether that's porn, whether that's a sexual relationship, just seeing that as bad or evil in some way has a way of just warping your mind. It's a terrible thing.
Yes. Yeah. So that was not good. I just remembered a couple of other things from like high school, college years that were kind of interesting. One of which, of course, was that I lived through the early years of Dungeons and Dragons and the Satanic Panic.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Literally one day my parents found out what Dungeons and Dragons was, and I had been maybe playing for 6 months or a year, right? Just not casually. And they put a stop to that pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was not something I felt so much guilty about as it was, well, I guess I'm not doing that anymore.
Right.
And I did, however, go through the period of like where rock music was bad, so I got rid of a bunch of records.
Yeah, I can't listen to Kiss any longer.
Right, stuff like that. And it was even more subtle than that, right? Anything that was secular was bad.
Okay, yeah.
So I went through all that stuff. Now, I did want to touch on another denomination that I crossed paths with in high school, was the Christian and Missionary Alliance.
Okay.
They're kind of a small denomination. They have a few colleges around the country. That was my Christian summer camp experience. So I was invited by a former girlfriend to attend summer camp with her and be on staff at this camp in Pennsylvania. So the first summer I did have a girlfriend. Again, it was fairly casual, but it was definitely some PDA going on. So give us credit for that. But aside from that, it was just like a whole summer of being around like altar calls and camp meetings, and they had like family week where the whole family came, So that was just kind of something in my Christian experience that was sort of interesting. Again, I know some people go to camp and have more dramatic experiences, but that was mine, you know. And again,
Yeah.
exposure to another faith tradition, but that was back in high school. So now we're fast forwarding through college a little. All of our professors were Christians, like I said. Even the math and science classes, we had one math professor who, not just Pascal's Wager, he literally read to us from Pascal's devotional book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was obviously my first exposure to Pascal's Wager, and it wasn't until like a year or two ago that I heard the rebuttals to that.
Right.
You know, which kind of makes sense now, but at the time you're like, yeah, why couldn't I just live this way?
Yeah. Yes.
What do you have to lose, right?
Yeah. For me, right near the end, like literally months before I kind of admitted it to myself, I had a conversation with a family member where I was referring to Descartes,
Oh yeah.
and Descartes, so beyond him saying, "I think, therefore I am," he goes on to talk about the knowing that the divine exists for kind of similar reasons, and I was kind of using that same argument to convince myself that I still believed, and really that was near the end. That was almost the end of it.
Okay. Yeah. So let's see. What other things do I recall about college? I said in my high school years, I became familiar with a lot of United Methodist people, right?
Hmm.
Now that culminated in my senior year of high school, where I actually lived with one of my high school teachers and her husband, because my parents, my dad got transferred again, my parents moved away. So that my senior year, I was basically getting a little taste of independence and living with a couple of, as they would call themselves, bleeding heart liberal Methodists,
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
right? So that presented me with the first time that I was outside that charismatic sphere, and I liked it. I really did. I mean, I had been in the choir, obviously, for a couple of years.
Hmm.
I went to a United Methodist church, and they had hymn books, and you could sing parts. And the services were a little more quiet, and they had a beginning and an end.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
I liked all that stuff. So I was kind of becoming a more evangelical at that point. And the reason that came to mind is because during college, those were the kind of churches that my girlfriend and I attended when we did. I mean, it wasn't every week because college was crazy. And basically, you had to find a local congregation who would accept you, you know, for the times that you were there.
Right.
By the way, the first thing my parents found out about my girlfriend was that she was a conservative Baptist, as in a member of a congregation in the Conservative Baptist Association.
Okay. Yes. And how did that go over?
Well, my dad famously said, Baptist, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess it was better than marrying a heathen.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's that whole charismatic sort of prejudice about if you don't walk in the fivefold ministry.
Full gospel. Yeah.
Right, exactly. You're missing some of your gospel
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And in all seriousness, it would become more of an issue like anytime we went to visit my parents and if they want us to go to church. And now we're both uncomfortable in going,
Right. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's about it for college. You know, I made some friends, lost track of most of them until Facebook came along.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, we got settled. The first year we lived closer to my parents, and the job opportunities were really not working out. So then we ended up moving down to New York near my wife's family, and where I've been now for these 20 years.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So we found ourselves in the Conservative Baptist Church where my wife was in her teenage years.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so she knew some people there, and we were there for a while. We ended up leaving. I progressed to that point because it was a small church and they were kind of desperate. They were like, and I was probably I was in my late 20s by then. They said, "We'd like you to be an elder."
Right. Right.
Well, I mean, I was a graduate of a Christian
That's
college,
right.
so I guess
Yeah. Yeah.
it wasn't too far out, but they were kind of low on men to guide the church, right? So
And clearly, somebody in their 20s should have all the wisdom of the world. So,
yeah, well, it gets worse. So I became an elder, and I think it was before our pastor left, and then we took on a new pastor. Now, a lot of people may know after the Southern Baptist scandals that Baptist churches find and hire their own pastors for each congregation.
Right.
So we found this guy who was coming from New England, and he had been at an American Baptist church, which is the more liberal, side of being a Baptist.
Okay.
But he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. That was just because that congregation was a little more conservative, and there's no issue with me coming from, an American Baptist church." So
that he had to be defensive says a lot, but yes.
well, he was being a little shifty, because what actually happened was he came in, and within a few months, his personality was kind of driving people away, and it got to the point where he was having a baptismal service just so he could welcome more people into the church who would vote his way.
Right. Okay.
So,
and the Baptist polity is really kind of a democratic one where that actually matters, right? Like you do votes in the Baptist church. So
yes,
so he was trying to tip the scales to get things to go his way.
Right. Well, and it was one of these things, like not exactly like in the book of Acts, right? Well, why don't we get baptized right now? No, it's not like that in the Baptist church.
Yeah.
You're supposed to have a scheduled service and everybody comes, right?
Right.
It was right around that time that a group of us stood in a Sunday service and called him out on his nonsense. And he pretty much said, "Well, I'm not going to quit, so you're going to have to sue me."
Wow. Fun times.
Yeah. So half of us left. It was a congregation of about 100 people. We moved on to another Baptist church a couple towns away. And I guess it worked out well, because we spent a lot of years there. Our daughter had just been born, and she got to spend overall a positive time. They had it was a growing congregation, and we actually moved to another building at one point. Our daughter had a great time in youth group, and about 8 years after our daughter was born, our son came along. His experience was not so positive. As he was growing up, he got involved with like the young boys group and didn't like it.
Okay.
So we got to a certain point right around the time that our daughter graduated high school where we said, I guess it was sometime when she was in college, we said, you know what, we need to move on. This place is getting too big, and my wife and my son were not enjoying it.
Yeah.
But before we get to that transition, I had become involved in a men's accountability group.
Okay.
Which, again, pretty positive, right? Until the last few years, when I've started to read about all this stuff with accountability and make sure you're telling everybody all your dirty laundry and confess your sins, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're nice guys. It's a group of 4 guys, and they're nice guys.
Yeah.
But it's probably just as well that our lives have gotten crazy and we've been meeting less, because I'm about to the point of no return with them.
Yeah. It's interesting, like the accountability groups, the idea of being vulnerable with other human beings is really important. Like we really need that. But if those other human beings see it as their job to correct you, then that is not going to end well.
Right. Just on the basis of like rank, right? Not any kind of personal interaction. Right. So, like I said, we got to the point where we were going to switch churches. It just so happens that our daughter's fiance, his family was in a church just like a mile away in the same town.
Okay.
Little weird, of course they're going to call it a God thing, whatever.
Yeah.
It was just one thing leads to another. So,
and in some parts of the country, you can look down the block and see multiple Baptist churches. So, but yes, go ahead.
Well, so this is another big shift, because we have this personal connection to this little congregation down the road. This was a church that was started in the 80s as a group of families coming together in a house church, and charismatic.
Okay.
So I'm looping back around again. And so that's where we are today. And the thing was, my son-in-law's dad is one of the pastors. So, it's basically a friendly environment for us.
Right.
Now, theologically, they're pretty good. Like if you're going to sit in on a sermon on a Sunday, there's not too much crazy stuff going on. They're actually pretty tame for a charismatic church. If you look around their book racks, you'll find some pretty wacko stuff that I recognize from my days, being in charismatic. But overall, it's an okay place to hang out on a Sunday, I guess. So that's where I'm at today.
Okay.
Now, what has started happening with me over the past few years is I've had a long time interest in cults,
Mhm.
like, just figuring out how they work, and anti-cult apologetics. For a while, when our son was born, so probably 15, 16 years ago, I would get weekly visits from Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mhm.
Those are probably the bigger group in our area, where I am is pretty close to their headquarters. So
Fun times. Okay.
yeah. Well, they don't visit as much. I don't know if I'm on a bad list or if they just have bigger fish to fry, because they do keep lists of people.
Sure.
Matter of fact, what's funny is I finally figured out where the local Mormon congregation was because I'd been driving by it several times a week. I said, "Oh, look, there it
Yeah.
is." But I think that's the one. So yeah, so I got involved with all this apologetic stuff. I used to listen to the Bible Answer Man. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I have. Yeah.
I used to listen to the last days of Walter Martin, and then getting into Hank Hanegraaff. I've read some of the books that they're promoting. I used to get their magazine, right? So all this to say, like, when a couple years ago, Leah Remini put out that Scientology show on A&E,
Yeah.
that sort of rekindled a lot of stuff in me.
Right.
Like, I came into it late and I binged it, like, doesn't everybody binge a show about
Right.
Scientology? Well, I sure did, because I really, like, they had not been on my radar previously. I was more focused on, like, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, your more traditional, like, personality cult.
Yeah.
So yeah, that got me really riled up. And I think the tipping point for me was I was listening to a podcast related to Scientology. Chris Shelton, if he ever hears this,
Yeah.
I know he's been on other podcasts, was talking to Matt Dillahunty, who is now obviously an outspoken atheist, formerly a Christian. I think he was a Baptist too. So anyway, so he's telling his elevator pitch about how he became an atheist. I'm like, wait a minute. I've always thought of atheists as like these mean people who just didn't believe in
Yeah.
God,
Yes.
So how does a person go from being a Christian to being an atheist? This was very interesting to me. So I'm thinking about it, and I'm also concurrently with all this Scientology stuff, I'm watching people talk about, well, when you first get into Scientology, it's all great and you feel like you're winning because they're teaching you how to clean up your finances and clean up your marriage and, whatever, get a job, right? All those introductory things in Scientology are very positive,
Right.
and people would describe those as conversion type experiences, right?
Right.
So my wheels are turning again, and I'm like, wait a minute. Cults have conversion experiences. Christians have conversion
Yeah. Yeah.
experiences. By the way, in my notes, I made a whole list of things that, like, I used to think were so unique about Christianity, and other groups have them too.
Right.
So I'm listening to this stuff about people exiting cults and sort of the group dynamic. I'm like, I used to think, like, well, you have to be very careful that your Christian congregation doesn't become a cult. And unfortunately, it happens more than you might think. And I'm like, well, why is that? And you get into if there's a God, then why is this and that and the other thing, right? Especially related to Christians.
Right. Why are there Christians who do not appear to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit? That's a hard question.
Right. And just piling on the cult stuff, another podcast that was a big influence on me, it's called Oh No, Ross and Carrie, right?
Yes.
And those two, for like the past almost 10 years, have been investigating fringe religious groups and outlandish claims in terms of health or science or whatever, right?
Right.
So in listening to them and their interactions with those kind of groups, again, you find these very positive people who are spouting these very crazy ideas, right?
Yeah.
What makes them so optimistic about something that's obviously wrong? This all kind of combined, I'm going to say probably 2 years ago now, to really tip me over.
I just wanted to say, you're telling my story. So alongside the Catholic side of that family, there's also a wing of that family that is Mormon.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't have a lot of interaction with them, but because of Facebook, I have all these cousins of mine and they're clearly Mormon and they're kind of evangelistic about it. And I thought, I haven't really studied Mormonism much. Let me go look up what is it that they really believe, right? I'd heard all the evangelical arguments against it, but in their own words, what is it that they think?
Mm-hmm.
And as I was kind of just reading their own material, I was having exactly the same experience that you're describing of, oh, they have conversion experiences. Man, they're talking just the way I would, like, and yet in my mind, Mormonism was clearly wrong, just clearly.
Yeah, see, the thing that kind of got me going, and by the way, Julia Sweeney also mentions the Mormons in her thing, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like tipping her over, like, hey, if they have these religious beliefs, then what do I believe, right? And of course, she lays out this really neat story about going around the world to figure it out, which most of us can't do. But
yes, yeah.
no, but with the Mormons, I remember one of their talking points is the burning in the bosom, right? If you read something and it really speaks to you, then maybe it's true.
Yeah.
But how do you find out if it's not?
Right. I think the point is that it allowed me to get to the outsider test for faith, right?
Oh, yeah.
It allowed me to see my perspective on Mormonism as this is crazy, and yet the Mormon would see my faith as equally crazy. And that was one of those huge breaking points for me personally. I don't know. Tell me about your experience.
Yeah, well, I use that a lot now. By the way, plug for The Good Place on NBC.
Yes, also excellent.
One of the things I've learned from there, and they have some real philosophers, who help them
Yes.
write the dialogue for that show. One of the things that you learn on there is a philosophical construct, which is, what if everybody behaved this way?
Yes.
But that's another thing that you could really apply, and they have applied it in shows like The Handmaid's Tale, right?
Right.
What if Christians really did take over society, as we've seen several times in history?
Yes. Yes.
So and some would argue we've seen some places in the United States. So yeah, no, I use that outsider test a lot now.
But for you were looking at apologetics, you were looking at Jehovah's Witnesses, you were looking at Mormonism. Was that the beginning of some doubts then?
Yeah, and I would say, like I said, this was back 2016, 2017. And actually, it was also right around the time I turned 50. So what happened then was I turned 50, which was not like, oh, well, I'm 50, so old. But it just coincided with me having some health issues, which, I'm come out of now. But, when you're kind of feeling run down for a lot of the time, your mood kind of drops.
Yeah.
Things seem more dramatic, right?
Yes.
So I think I would classify that, again, going back to The Good Place, as my existential crisis was right around that time. I thought maybe, whatever I'm doing, with my life isn't so important. And if I do have a part in God's plan, maybe it's not such a big part,
Okay.
I had some regrets. I had some health issues. And that's when all this podcast stuff started jogging around in my head.
Right.
So that was really kind of like the starting point was maybe 2016.
Can you think of what broke first? Was there a particular argument that really got to you, or a particular point of faith that you just no longer believed? Or how did that go?
Well, like I said, the conversion thing was big for me, because I've heard people say if you lived a good Christian life, that your testimony was not really that exciting, right?
Yeah.
So I'd always held as one of the points in my testimony that, well, I saw the changes in the lives of people around me, and it really made me see that God made a big difference in your life, right?
Right.
So this, compared to other religions, and anyone who comes off of drugs or comes out of a bad situation and they attribute it to any religion, they'll tell you that was the cause, right?
Yes. And so what do you consider yourself now? Do you have a label for yourself?
Well, and I've heard a lot of people say this, I would have to say I behave as an atheist, and I will say I'm an agnostic atheist.
Okay.
Because I would like to maintain some wonder in the world. Like, ever since, since literally I was born in the year of Star Trek, I've always been a science fiction fan. I was enamored of computers and technology ever since I was a kid. So I would like to think that somewhere out there in the universe that, maybe we'd like get to explore it somehow.
Okay.
If not now, then in some kind of existence after. But I can't assign any other values to it than that.
Right.
I would say that humanism is appealing to me. I haven't done a whole lot to study on it, because when I was growing up in the early 80s especially was when you started to hear secular humanists are taking over the world. We got to stop them.
Yes, those terrible humanists caring
Right.
about people.
And it wasn't until I heard Bart Campolo on the Humanize Me podcast where I said, humanism sounds like it's not so bad.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Okay, so one of the things that I thought was very interesting about your story is you have not come out to your family yet. You haven't told your wife. Is that correct?
Okay, so this is how it goes. I came to this conclusion. So I guess maybe beginning of last year. I'd have to see if it's even in my notes when I did this. But I approached my son, who is now 17,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, I just want you to know that how I believed before, I don't necessarily believe that way now. And I wanted to tell you this because I know that you've had some difficulty believing it yourself over the years.
Mm,
Our daughter has always been, they're both good kids, but our daughter has always been enthusiastic about it.
right.
She was really in on studying and really in on youth group. Like I said, our son has had hurdles with all that stuff, and we're a homeschool family because, again, my wife believed in it strongly. When our daughter was in like first grade and she was having a lot of trouble at school, she said, I think I can do this. Let me do this. So we got into it. And again, she made it out the other side doing great. Our son being homeschooled with the religious part of it has not been as positive. So this is
Right.
why I figured let me share this with him.
Yeah.
So I've told him, I've told a couple of relatives who either are atheist or have had serious struggles with religion because I figured they'd be a positive audience.
Right.
But yeah, I haven't really tried to talk anybody down in my family who's strongly, a believer because I don't want to have that kind of argument right now.
Right.
And this is something that I've heard from Bart Campolo, right? Recently on his podcast, he said, I'll counsel people, why do you want to tell your family why you got to have a good reason. You don't just have to go blurt it out to them. You don't owe it to them or anything, and it might be more trouble than it's worth.
No, and I definitely agree with that. And for the people that are listening as well, the number one thing is your safety and your needs, right? And if you need to maintain relationships that might be damaged by that kind of thing, you don't owe that to anyone, right?
Right.
You get to own your own thoughts, and they are yours, and you get to choose who you reveal those to.
Right. And I do remember something my wife said a long time ago when it came to our children. She said, well, I might let some things slide, but when it comes to my kids, I'll stand up. And it may come to that too. Like when I was a believer, if someone had challenged me on my beliefs, then maybe I would have stood up. And now that I believe a different way, if you're going to challenge me and say, whatever, this Christian thing is going to interfere with your life, and maybe I have to stand up then. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody told me, we're not going to bother going to church anymore, I'd be like, fine, that's cool.
Right. Two things. I want to explore being a non-believer in church because I have that experience quite often myself.
Uh-huh.
But I also want to mention, I think it's interesting. My children also had an impact on me about the time that they were the right age to be baptized. And we were exploring that for them. I had the same thing where one was very enthusiastic and one was a little apprehensive about it. And that process of feeling like I was pushing, especially the apprehensive one,
Mm-hmm.
to do something that she wasn't entirely prepared to do of her own volition also shook me. Like, this feels like indoctrination rather than something that she is freely choosing.
Yeah, see, baptism is another thing. I mean, we don't have baptisms very often in our church because it's a smaller congregation of mostly older people. But yeah, our son really hasn't mentioned it one way or the other.
I guess I bring it up just to say that the experience of being a parent and feeling obligated to pass down your faith to your children and then watching the way that they independently respond to that, whether positively or negatively,
Mm-hmm.
mirrors back to you something that you might not experience without going through that. And so in your case, you have a daughter who embraced it enthusiastically and a son who has struggled with that, right?
Right.
And that tells you something.
Well, the interesting thing is now that my daughter and her husband are out on their own, and again, they have to tread a certain way because they're to save money. They're living with his parents, and he does participate in a church worship band. So I say it in that context that I don't know how enthusiastic they are about church or not, being millennials, right?
Right.
And how that's changing. I know that in terms of culturally and socially, they've adopted very different positions than I would have adopted at their age in my 20s, in the late 80s, early 90s,
Right.
right back at the height of conservatism. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to watch.
And again, I don't like to talk too much about my kids, but the one who was apprehensive does identify as a believer, but she has a very liberal theology, very, very liberal. She's much more concerned about the social issues around her than being theologically dogmatic. She doesn't care about that at all. So,
Yeah, see, that's the interesting thing to me. And my son, I think, would just rather not with the whole thing. Yeah, like our daughter is, very LGBTQ affirming, and
right.
she studies feminist issues, in college. And my wife and I, we're not all up in arms like I wasn't 5 years ago up in arms about it. We just kind of look at each other and smile like we don't know where this came from. This is the Christian homeschooled kid.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
So I don't know where they're getting their thoughts from these days, these kids, but I kind of like it.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk also about the experience of being a non-believer or a doubter or whatever label you choose and being in church. What is that like for you? Like, do you participate? Do you sing? You mentioned
Okay.
you pass the communion along, but what are the things that you do participate in?
All right. So going back a little ways, because we've been at this church now for probably 3 years or more. I used to be involved for a long time in the church choir.
Okay.
And probably one of the warning bells I should have had going off in my head was that I could be up in the choir loft and kind of like zoning out and singing at the same time.
Okay.
Where it was kind of like, maybe more like a meditation,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I was really sort of checked out. And that's the way I was at church for a long, I mean, it's not uncommon for people to say that I zone out at church, but
Yeah.
this should have been a warning to me as far as my spiritual maturity. You know what I mean? Nowadays, I'm very much aware why that is. Again, because it's a small church, they asked me to volunteer to usher. And I don't know if you've ever seen the episode of Everybody Loves Raymond where they had the church ushers. But the joke was they volunteer to usher because they can be at church, but they could also be outside of church.
Yes.
And I found that to be somewhat true. I only do it maybe once every 6 weeks.
Okay.
But that's one of those weeks. So check that off.
Yeah.
My wife's health being what it is, it's kind of like week to week where we attend church. So that kind of lets me off the hook sometimes. But when I'm there, I'm kind of like the impartial observer now. And I do sing along to some extent, maybe not as enthusiastically as I used to. But yeah, it's just kind of like a look and, observing attitude.
Right.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, we have the weekly prayer for the president, which on many levels, is a little bit discouraging, but it is what it is.
Interesting. So I'm curious, again, your experience, that's a really interesting way to say it as an objective observer.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that you experience differently now, like that you interpret in a different light by being an independent observer?
Yeah, I would say that altar calls have always been a source of stress for me.
Okay.
And again, if going back to my church camp experience, right, especially at summer camp, you're like, oh, we got to go up, and you see like teenage girls up there crying away whatever they were crying away, right?
Yeah. That
always used to make me feel uncomfortable. Now I will only go up for my wife's benefit if she feels the need to go up for prayer or for whatever reason like that. But it doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
Again, being a charismatic church, you'll have people going around and praying over people and prophesying over people. I always used to get nervous that what portentous words are they going to say over me, and will I live up to it?
Yeah.
Now I'm like, okay, what do you got?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I have to say, and I don't mean to color your experience, but for me, I find it painful because the underlying manipulation I can no longer unsee.
Right.
There's an element of manipulation that just really grates at me.
I would say that we're fortunate in the fact that the congregation that we're in right now are basically well-meaning people.
Sure.
And if they conduct church in a certain way, it's just because it's the way that they're comfortable doing it. But I can see what you mean. Like I remember when our previous church was in growth mode, they were very conscious of like, oh, let's not interrupt the flow of the service, and let's make sure that people stay in an attitude of worship, and
Yeah.
all that sort of manipulative stuff.
Yeah. One last question, and you can refuse to answer here. I'll edit it out. With your wife, I mean, obviously, a marriage is a deeply intimate, spiritual, even relationship.
Mhm.
How do you handle kind of keeping that part of yourself separate in that relationship?
All right. So way back when, again, my personality has always been sort of introverted and quiet, right? Which
Mhm.
is why the charismatic stuff never really took with me. I can only count on a few times when I attempted to speak in tongues or raise my hands. Like again, you asked me what do I feel differently about now that I don't feel bad about not raising my hands anymore.
Yeah, guilt free.
Yeah. So, and this kind of spilled over into being the spiritual head of my home.
Right.
I've always been quieter. Like my wife is the stronger personality between us. There's no secret about it.
Yeah.
She has educated the kids in as part of homeschooling with Bible. I only did the devotional things very occasionally, and we very rarely pray together. And again, years ago, we just attributed it to my personality. We've been married over 30 years now, so
Right.
none of this is news. I think it's just a shift in my mind that has given me a little bit of peace about it.
Right. And you don't get a response from her. She's not questioning you. She's not asking.
No, because like I said, that ship has sailed.
Okay.
We're supportive of each other in other ways. Like I'm always helping her out, and we love each other.
Right.
I'm not like one of those husbands that says, "Don't bother me with this stuff at home, woman." We're
Yeah.
very supportive of each other, and we have certain things in common, like TV shows and stuff like that. So, and
Yeah.
she wants to talk to me about something that she's reading or whatever. Occasionally she'll do that, and that's fine.
Yeah. So I'm very much out to my wife and my immediate family. And
Yeah.
I actually want my wife to share with me the things that she's reading in her spiritual. What I tell her is human beings have, and I interpret it as a natural thing, but a quote unquote spiritual element to them. And I care about you. I love you. So I care about your spiritual development. So I want to be a part of that. But for her, that is too threatening, right? She feels like she has to withhold that from me.
Oh, like she's going to be on the defensive.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and I actually kind of have mourned that loss a little bit. Not that I wanted to be the head of household, quote unquote, but rather I care about her and I care about what she cares about. So it's interesting to hear kind of the other side of being not revealing that information and getting to participate in her spiritual experience.
Right. Like again, I don't know if she ever got to this point in the podcast, she might be really upset. I could see where she would be more upset with this than she would be like, oh, that's it, I'm getting a divorce, because we're
Yeah.
really not in that kind of a situation where we are mutually supportive. It would be very damaging to do that.
Right.
I think going back to my in-laws a little bit, there might be a similar dynamic there that she might not appreciate. But again, I'm trying to be more supportive as far as that goes.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of where it's at. But I can see where your wife doesn't want to be the defender of Christianity either.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I'm in no ways trying to argue her out of faith in any way. What I really honestly mean, I want to support her in her spiritual endeavors. But even that is just too threatening for her. She feels like revealing that intimate part of herself to someone who doesn't believe. Her perception of atheism is very aggressive, and even though I'm trying to dissuade her of that idea. Anyway, I'm getting too deep into revealing, but just to say, I think it's a fascinating mirror here of being able to participate, being able to be a part of her spiritual experience. I think that's interesting.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, what I've heard about in the past couple of years through all these podcasts is street epistemology. And I'm sure a lot of
Yes.
people are familiar with that now. But I read the book where he laid out the premise, sort of like asking questions to spark discussion rather than arguments, right?
Right.
In that context, he also talked about getting kind of to the root cause of why someone believes. And if the reason someone believes is, well, my grandmother believed and I really loved my grandmother, then you're not going to argue them out of that.
Right.
Whereas someone like me, like I'm kind of like analyzing this after the fact. I'm saying, well, I believed because you literally people that I knew believed, right?
Right.
But as I'm analyzing their experiences, I'm finding out how not so unique they are after all.
Right.
So that kind of made it crumble. But if somebody had come to me like, God doesn't exist and all this stuff, that would not have been appealing to me. That kind of like throws up the defenses.
Absolutely. And I have friends of mine who were atheists who talked to me prior to when I was ready. And we had very cordial debates, but it was unconvincing to me at all at the time.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing that's firming me up a little bit in my lack of belief is I'm seeing people, and I'm going to count you in this category, who tried a lot harder than me. And somehow they ended up here too. Whereas
Yeah.
I always felt, again, like the underachiever, right? So,
Interesting. Yeah. No, I think the story of the deconversion, deconstruction community is lots of people who were totally dedicated, 100% dedicated, and were trying their hardest and then fought the doubts to the bitter end. All of us have a slightly different experience. I hope that you get released from that sense of guilt, right?
yes. Yeah, I think I'm pretty much there.
Yeah.
There may be like, now it's kind of like, oh, what could I have done with all that time,
Yeah.
whatever. But like I hear these, I'm going to call you kids in your 20s and 30s saying I wasted all that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Come talk to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Cass Midgley
Yes.
from Everyone's Agnostic, he is about a couple weeks younger than me.
Okay.
So, and he came out, a few years before I did. So that's basically the timeline we're talking about here,
Right.
and again, he was way beyond where I was in terms of achievement.
So, Fred, I want to give you an opportunity. If there's if I have not asked the right question, is there a topic that you wanted to bring up at all?
Here's something. I'm looking at the number of pages in my notes, 45 pages now worth of stuff that I've written down since the beginning of this year. I'm going to recommend that if you're going through this process, start writing it down, partly because it'll help you to establish a timeline like I have, and also because it does help to kind of lay it all out there, and you can think through, therapy is probably the next step for me, but
Yeah.
similar to therapy, you can think it out, write it down, put it outside yourself and kind of analyze it a little bit. Now I'm to the point where if I happen to make a comment on somebody's post in a secret Facebook group, right? Because I'm in a few of those now. If I like my response, I'll be like, throw it in my notes, right?
Yeah.
Whatever the topic. So that I would definitely recommend, even whether you do it on paper or a Google Doc or whatever works for you.
I totally agree with you that writing out your story is really, really valuable. And that's a good segue, Fred. Are there any other suggestions that you have for people who might be experiencing doubt or finding themselves on the outside?
Well, I would say that probably the best resources are people who have been through your similar faith tradition and come out. Maybe not the angry ones, but the ones who are a little more even-handed in their telling of their story and the reasons that they came out. Those are probably the best. Probably, again, toward the end of last year, I came across one of Dan Barker's books for the first time.
Okay.
And, he was an evangelical missionary and pastor for a long time. And then he ended up coming out the other side, and he lays it all out. The first section of his book, Godless, is a biography. And then the second section is basically anti-apologetics.
Right.
Right. So I think stuff like that can help you. You take your time, you read a book, you think about it a little bit, and then see where you end up. A lot of people end up maybe not in the Christian faith tradition, but maybe they want to explore something else,
Right. You also have mentioned a number of podcasts. You want to give you an opportunity, and I'm not fishing here for this podcast, but
well, everybody's listening to this one already, or they wouldn't know.
Yeah, exactly. But what are the other podcasts that you recommend for people?
Okay. There's a relatively new one that I'll recommend. Maybe you haven't heard of it. It's called Born Again Again.
I just recently heard it, and I've heard one episode. They're great so far.
And they're at bornagainagain.co. That's a young couple who, well, they're young to me, okay?
Yeah.
They're in their late 20s, early 30s. They met in college and got married and got involved with what was by then called Cru, Campus Crusade. Mm-hmm. They talk about how that kind of pushed them out the other side of faith. Very interesting, relatively new podcast. But I'm listening to probably some of the biggies, like Everyone's Agnostic has been around for a while.
Yeah.
Oh, Voices of Deconversion. I've gone through a lot of those, if not all of them. I listen to Atheist Experience now as kind of like the bookend to the Bible Answer Man.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
I'm like, and here we are 30 years later.
Yes.
Those are great. And there's all kinds of podcasts out there. There's one out there that is countering the Unbelievable podcast. If you've ever heard of that, that's a British Christian podcast where they bring together Christians and atheists to kind of have a civil discussion, right? There's a group that's come out with something called Still Unbelievable, where they are atheists who are doing a rebuttal for like each episode.
Yeah, and plug for mine. A few episodes back, I interviewed both Matthew Taylor and Andrew Knight.
That's right.
Who are the hosts of that podcast. So yeah, definitely go check those out and check their podcasts out as well.
So I don't think I'm covering any new ground here, but that's what I like. Literally, I used to mostly listen to entertainment podcasts about like TV show recaps and stuff like that. Now it's all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I hear you.
So I just wanted to add my voice to the hundreds or thousands that have come before.
Well, I think it's very important, right? Each of us has unique elements of our story. And as you said, somebody coming out of a similar faith tradition is going to respond to your story in a way that they wouldn't mine or someone else's. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And here's my final thoughts, because my parents are still involved in this, and my church to some extent, the Word of Faith movement. Okay. Kind of like, I'll liken it to The Secret in terms of its history. Anyone who wants you to think that you can stand on the strength of your faith and get what you want is placing a burden on you, because so many times what you really wish for will not come true and you'll blame yourself. Mm. I would say give that some thought. Maybe look at some of the people who have come out of that and see how they're doing, and don't put such a big burden on yourself to, if I really believe, that God will bless me. Because I mean, in everybody's life, you're going to have good times and bad times, but placing it on your own belief is, again, it's the kind of stuff that used to weigh me down.
As I've said before, truly free indeed. Like when you let go of the burden of trying to defend the faith that just doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
So Fred, thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. As Fred suggested, it is a good idea to seek out the stories of those people who came from your own faith tradition. I think this is important in that the shared experience, the sense of not being alone and having someone else out in the world that has gone through the same things that you have, is really, really valuable and cathartic. I find it interesting that Fred and I have similar stories in that looking at anti-cult apologetics or looking at other faith traditions allowed us to see the outsider test for faith for our own faith and recognize the similarities and ultimately lead us on the way out. I also felt a lot of kinship with Fred in discussing parenting children and trying to pass on that faith and having that be a part of our own deconstruction. And ultimately, I want to affirm what Fred said, that we do not owe it to anyone to reveal our innermost thoughts. In particular, your safety is of highest importance, and your mental and physical health are of highest importance. So if coming out to your family or the people around you would be detrimental, you don't owe them anything. Only when you decide that it is best for you do you need to tell the world or tell friends or tell family. Having said that, I will say that it is a cathartic experience to tell your story, just as you heard Fred do today. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is a point where Fred and I seem to be talking past one another just a little bit. And that is when I was talking about my relationship with my believing wife. The point I was trying to make is that I care about her as a whole human being, which includes her spirituality. And I want to encourage her in all of her endeavors, including her seeking after her spiritual welfare. I was very much not talking about trying to dissuade her or convince her or change her mind in any way. And I think it's important that we respond to the believers in our lives by treating them as full human beings and caring for them and loving them the way we want to be cared for and loved. And that is your secular grace thought of the day. Until next time, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.